The ultimate wholesaler. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to Top Wholesaler Secrets, the 4-part series on how to go from 0 to 6 and 7 figures in as short as time as possible with wholesale real estate. What's up, guys? This is your main man, Chris Enze, aka the ultimate wholesaler. If you're seeing this video, that means that you're looking to do your first or next wholesale deals within the next 30 to 90 days. Right? All right. Now, if that's true, you're definitely in the right place. So congratulations, you have reached the 4th and final installment of the Top Wholesaler Secrets series, where we cover the role of the closing manager. We're also going to discuss the full closing process in this video. Now, if you haven't watched the first 3 parts of the series, I suggest that you go back and watch those videos first, because this video will probably not make any sense without understanding the concepts that we mentioned in the first 3 videos of the series. But if you have watched the videos and are ready to move forward, let me hear you say, I'm ready. Alright, cool. So before we dig in on the role of the closing manager, let's quickly recap what we have learned so far. So once the acquisitions manager has done their marketing and made contact with a potential seller, they're going to gauge that seller's motivation and then set up the initial appointment for the seller manager. The seller manager will then take over and research the property, quickly re-gauge the seller's motivation, confirm the appointment, go on the appointment, and then submit an offer and or negotiate with the seller or follow up until they can reach an agreement in price. Once the agreement is reached, the seller manager will then get a signed contract from the seller. Once the seller manager has a signed agreement, the seller manager will then send that agreement over to both the buyer manager and the closing manager. Once the buyer manager has the agreement, they're first going to research the property a little bit, and then they're going to start to market the property at a higher price than what we have agreed to pay the seller. The buyer manager will then pre-screen the buyers and negotiate a purchase price. Once we have a solid purchase price and we have a cash buyer that is ready to move forward, the buyer manager will then get a signed agreement from that cash buyer and then send that document over to the closing manager. And here we are at the closing manager position. So once the closing manager has a signed agreement from both the seller and an end buyer, it's now time to send that information over to the closing attorney, or the title company that will perform the actual closing and do what is called a title search. The title search is very important because the title company or closing attorney is going to be responsible for making sure that the transfer of ownership from one party to another is done legally and ethically. The title search is the process of making sure that all parties that have a claim to ownership against the property have been notified to the sale of the property and also will be paid at the time of the closing. Now, the title company and or the closing attorney are going to hold specialized insurance to guarantee the validity of their findings and their processes, so nothing is on you as a wholesaler. The title search process typically takes anywhere from about 3 to 7 days. Now, in many cases, there will be no issues with the title and the seller will be able to transfer the title over to you or your end buyer, depending on the type of closing that we set up. Now, if there's a problem with the title company or the closing attorney will inform the closing manager and also let them know what needs to be done to actually close the property. If this is the case, the closing manager will then reach out to the seller and or the buyer if needed and let them know what needs to be done in order to resolve the issues. Typically, when there's an issue with the title, the burden to resolve it typically resides on the shoulders of the seller. The closing manager may have to even get in contact with the seller manager to help the seller understand what needs to be done next. Because the seller manager has had the most contact with the seller and has built a relationship with them, it might be a little bit more beneficial for the seller manager to step in and resolve any issues that may come up. Once the title search is completed and all parties are okay with the sale of the property, the closing manager will then contact the title company or the closing attorney and get a solid date to close the transaction. Once the closing manager has confirmed the date from the title company or the closing attorney, the closing manager will then need to get into contact with both the seller and the end buyer to come in and close their transaction on that closing date. Now, typically, in wholesale transactions, the buyer and seller will come into the closing table at different times, but on the same day. Once at the closing table, the parties will actually sign their documents and transfer the ownership of the title and also transfer the funds from the end buyer to the seller and the wholesaler. Now listen to me very, very carefully. The closing process is not fully completed until all parties have signed the appropriate paperwork and also have all been paid in full. I repeat, the closing process is not fully completed until all parties have signed the appropriate paperwork and all parties have been paid in full, the seller and the wholesaler. Once all parties are paid, the deal is actually closed and the closing manager's job is completed for the most part. The closing manager is also responsible for following up and making sure that all parties are happy with the results of the transaction. You know, sometimes we're going to do surveys and thank you cards and sometimes even gifts. But after this, it's all pretty much a rinse and repeat. And that's pretty much the full wholesale real estate process for the most part. And there you have it, the final part of the wholesale process completed. So let's recap and go through all the steps really quickly. Once the acquisition manager has done their marketing and made contact with a potential seller, gauge the seller's motivation and then set up that initial appointment for the seller manager will then take over and research the property, quickly re-gauge the seller's motivation, confirm the appointment, go on the appointment, and then they're going to submit an offer and or negotiate with the seller or follow up until they reach an agreement in price. Once the agreement is reached, the seller manager will then get a signed contract from the seller. Once the seller manager has a signed agreement, the seller manager is then going to send that agreement over to both the buyer manager and the closing manager. Once the buyer manager has the agreement, they're going to start to market the property at a higher price than what we have agreed to pay the seller. The buyer manager will then start to pre-screen the buyers and negotiate a purchase price. Once we have a solid purchase price and a cash buyer that's ready to move forward, the buyer manager will then get a signed agreement from that buyer and then send all the documents over to the closing manager. Once the closing manager has both a signed contract from the seller and a signed contract from the buyer at a higher price, the next step will be to submit the documents to the title company / closing attorney. And then we will start the title search. Once the title search is completed, if the title is not clear, the title company or the closing attorney is going to advise the closing manager on what needs to happen in order to proceed with a closing. The closing manager will then be responsible for relaying that information over to the seller and or the seller manager, and sometimes even the buyer if it's necessary. And all they're going to do after that is wait on a response. Now, if the title is clear and all parties are ready to proceed, the closing manager will set up a closing date with the title company or the closing attorney, and also with the seller and the end buyer. Once all parties have signed the agreements, the closing manager will confirm that all parties have been paid out. Now, after the payments, the closing manager will do a follow-up with the buyer and the seller to make sure that they had a great experience. And that's it. Pretty simple, right? Once we have broken down the process into those different management areas. Like I said before, many of the top wholesalers around the country use a system like this to do millions a year in profits. And you can too if you follow this system and the management areas. I hope that you enjoyed this Top Wholesaler Secrets and are now empowered to take action. If so, great. I know that you can go out there and kill it if you decide and commit and take consistent action. Now, while this series was very informative and filled with many of the action steps to get you on the fast track to do your first deal, there are many things that I was not able to cover just because I simply could not put it all into 10 to 20 minute videos. But again, if you just take what I shared in these videos, you can actually go out and do your first few deals within the next 30 to 90 days. Now, if you love what you heard and would like help on closing your first few or next few deals, don't worry, I do have a solution. I set aside some time to work with a select few people and get them to their first deals within the next 30 to 90 days via group coaching training called the Flipping Bricks Challenge. Now, if you're looking for more in-depth information on the wholesale process and also want to start working on your own deals that you can close within the next 30 to 90 days, I would love to get on a call and set up a time for us to talk about your lead acquisition system and personal customized blueprint to put you on the fast track to closing your first deals ASAP.
Ultimate home